I never told my daughter about my seven-figure trust fund that had been quietly compounding since my late husband's inheritance 20 years ago. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to see who she really was, without the weight of expectation crushing her into someone she wasn't meant to be. My name is Eleanor Catherine Prescott, and I have spent the last 3 decades watching people transform the moment they learn about money. I have seen friendships dissolve overnight. I have seen family members suddenly remember they have debts they never mentioned before. I have seen eyes change from warm to calculating, from genuine to transactional, in the space of a single sentence. So when my daughter Victoria called me on a Tuesday morning in March, her voice trembling with something that sounded like pride mixed with anxiety, I knew something significant was about to happen. She said, "Mom, I'm getting married. His name is Daniel, and I want you to meet his family this Friday at a restaurant in the city. They're flying in from Monaco. His mother is the CEO of a luxury resort chain, and his father is a venture capitalist who invests in tech startups. I need you to please be yourself, okay? Just be Mom." I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, looking out at the garden I had spent years cultivating with my own hands, and I felt something shift inside me. Victoria had always been the sensitive one, the daughter who worried about how others perceived her, who bent herself into shapes to accommodate people's expectations. And now she was marrying into what sounded like a family of titans. I told her I would be there, that I would wear something nice, that everything would be fine. But as soon as I hung up the phone, a thought began forming in my mind. A thought that would define everything that came next. What if I didn't show up as the woman I actually was? What if I showed up as the woman Victoria seemed to expect me to be? What if I became, for one evening, the poor and struggling mother she might be ashamed of? Not out of malice, you understand. Not out of a desire to hurt anyone, but out of a desperate curiosity to understand whether this family, whether Daniel, would judge my daughter based on her mother's circumstances. Would they love her less if her mother was struggling? Would they treat her differently if her family wasn't wealthy? And most importantly, would Victoria herself feel ashamed? Comment below where you are watching this from and what time it is right now. The idea consumed me for 3 days. I found myself walking through my house, the house that had been paid for in full by my husband's inheritance, the house with the original hardwood floors and the marble countertops, and the walk-in closet where I kept clothes I hadn't worn in years because I preferred simplicity to ostentation. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was 58 years old. My hair had gone gray naturally over the past 5 years, and I had decided not to dye it because I found a strange kind of beauty in letting time mark you honestly. My face had lines around my eyes from smiling, from squinting at gardens, from living. I wasn't the sort of woman who turned heads anymore, if I ever had been. I was the sort of woman people forgot they had met. I was, in other words, invisible, and I had learned to treasure that invisibility because it meant people treated me with an honesty they reserved for no one else. So I made a plan. I went to the discount supermarket on the other side of town, the one I had never shopped at before, the one where everything was off-brand and the fluorescent lights were too bright. I bought a dress from the clearance rack, a shapeless beige linen thing that hung on me like I was a hanger. I bought shoes from a discount bin, shoes that were slightly worn and scuffed. I bought a wig, a gray wig that made me look 10 years older than I actually was. I didn't buy jewelry. Instead, I found in the back of a drawer an old purse my mother had given me decades ago. A purse that had been cheap when it was new and was positively ancient now, held together with a prayer and a safety pin. I looked at myself in the mirror on Friday afternoon, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked like a woman who had struggled. I looked like a woman who had given up. I looked like the kind of mother Victoria might apologize for. And when I saw that reflection, I felt a moment of doubt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. What was I doing? Was this honesty or cruelty? Was this wisdom or manipulation? Was this an act of love or an act of deception? But then I thought about all the times I had watched Victoria choose her words carefully around people with money. I thought about the way she sometimes apologized for things she shouldn't have had to apologize for. I thought about the way she seemed to make herself smaller in rooms where she should have felt tall. And I decided that Friday night was going to be about giving her permission to be exactly who she was, regardless of what her family looked like. So, I got in my car. The 7-year-old sedan I drove because it worked perfectly well, and I saw no reason to replace a functioning vehicle with something new, and I drove to the restaurant. It was a place called The Meridian, a 5-star establishment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, and a dress code that required a jacket for men and smart casual for everyone else. I had been there once before, for my husband's 50th birthday party, back before he died. Back when I still wore heels and jewelry and thought that the right outfit could change how the world saw you. Now I wore my discount store dress and my scuffed shoes and my aging wig, and I walked through those glass doors feeling like I was stepping into a completely different life. The hostess looked at me, and I watched something happen in her eyes. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. A recalibration, a downward adjustment. She took me to the table where Victoria sat with a man I assumed was Daniel, tall, blonde, aristocratic, and 2 other people who were unmistakably his parents. Victoria saw me coming, and I watched her face go through a series of micro-expressions. First joy, then confusion, then something that looked terrifyingly like shame. Her mother had arrived, and her mother looked like she had lost everything. Victoria stood up quickly, perhaps more quickly than was necessary, and introduced me to Daniel, whose handshake was firm and brief and contained no warmth. Then she introduced me to his parents. His mother was named Margot, and his father was named Philippe. Margot was exactly what I had expected, a woman in her early 60s who had had work done. Good work, expensive work, but work nonetheless. She wore a dress that probably cost more than my car payment, and her hair was styled in a way that suggested she visited a salon in a city like Paris or Milan or London. Philippe was taller than his son, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from a life spent on yachts. They both looked at me, and I watched something happen in their expressions. It was the same recalibration I had seen in the hostess's eyes, but magnified. It was the look of people who were suddenly trying to understand how they had ended up sitting across from someone like me. "So, you're Eleanor," Margot said, her accent indicating that she had spent significant time speaking French. "Victoria has told us about you." She had told them about me, I was sure, but not like this. Not as the woman sitting across from them in a dress from a discount rack and shoes that were falling apart. Margot's eyes traveled from my shoes to my bag, taking inventory, making calculations. I could see her mentally comparing me to some standard of acceptability and finding me wanting. Philippe offered me wine, and when the waiter brought the bottle, something French and expensive that I couldn't pronounce, Philippe launched into a discussion about the vineyard, about the terroir, about the particular characteristics of the soil and the climate, and the way the winemaker had personally overseen every aspect of the harvest. It was the kind of monologue designed to establish expertise, to create a hierarchy of knowledge, to position himself as someone who understood the finer things and by extension implied that not everyone at the table did. I sipped the wine, which tasted like wine to me, like grapes and fermentation and nothing more, and I watched Margot watch me. Her eyes were calculating. I could see her running numbers in her head, estimating my net worth based on my shoes, my bag, my dress, my wig. She was trying to figure out how poor I was, and when she settled on a number, I watched something shift in her posture. She relaxed slightly, the way you relax when you know you are safe. When you know you don't have to worry about the person across from you asking for money or connections or favors. "So, Eleanor," Margot said after Philippe had finished his dissertation on wine, "what is it that you do?" Victoria suddenly became very interested in her napkin. I watched her fold it, refold it, smooth it out on her lap. I watched her not make eye contact with me or with her future mother-in-law, and I understood, in that moment, that this was the question she had been dreading. Because the honest answer, that I had inherited a substantial amount of money from my late husband and had spent the last 20 years managing it, living modestly, and building a life that didn't require me to work. That answer would raise more questions than it answered. It would invite scrutiny. It would create confusion. So instead of answering as the real Eleanor, I answered as the Eleanor I was pretending to be. "Oh, I work retail," I said, my voice taking on a slightly uncertain quality, as if I was apologizing for something shameful. "I work at a department store, in the women's clothing section. It's not much, but it keeps me busy." The lie came out so smoothly that I almost believed it myself, and I watched Margot's expression shift again. Relief washed across her face like a tide. She had been right about me. I was exactly as poor as she had thought, maybe even poorer. Philippe launched into a discussion about the importance of good work, how even menial jobs had dignity, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a complicated concept to a child. He was being gracious, I realized. He was being kind to the poor woman sitting across from him who worked in retail and probably didn't understand anything about wine or investment or the complexities of international business. Victoria said, very quietly, "Mom is very hard-working." No one acknowledged this. Instead, Margot turned to Victoria and said, "You must be so proud of your independence, darling. Being with someone from a successful family, building your own path. It's quite admirable, really, how you're making your own way, despite your circumstances." There was a barbed quality to this statement, hidden under a layer of what appeared to be a compliment. She was saying, in essence, it's admirable that you're not entirely useless despite coming from nothing. The waiter arrived with the first course, something involving foie gras and microgreens, and a sauce that Philippe informed us had been infused with a particular type of truffle oil that could only be sourced from a specific region of Italy. I ate it. It was delicious, and I said so. And then I made a small mistake. I said, "This is nice. I usually get my groceries from the discount store, so this is very different from what I'm used to." Philippe smiled, the smile you smile at someone who has just said something endearingly unsophisticated, and he began explaining the difference between discount store food and fine dining food, as if the problem wasn't my budget, but my palate. As if given education and exposure, I might eventually understand what refined taste actually meant. And I sat there, in my discount dress and my scuffed shoes and my aging wig, and I listened to him explain my own inferiority to me. And I felt something building inside me. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something more complicated than anger. It was disappointment in humanity. It was sadness that people like Margot and Philippe had built their entire identities around the acquisition of things, around the creation of hierarchies, around the establishment of their own superiority. It was sadness that they couldn't meet me, whoever I was, without first calculating my worth. And it was a kind of cold determination to show them, before the night was over, exactly who they were sitting across from. The main course arrived, and with it came a conversation about investment portfolios. Philippe had made a recent investment in a tech startup that was disrupting the blockchain space, whatever that meant. He spoke about it with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had made a significant amount of money from this disruption. And he made certain to mention the price of his beach house in Montego Bay, which he had purchased with the profits from his investment ventures. Margot added her own accomplishments to the conversation. She had recently expanded her resort chain into South America, and she was considering a location in Argentina that she was quite excited about. The expansion, she mentioned casually, was going to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million. She said it the way someone else might say, "I'm thinking of redecorating my kitchen." Daniel, Victoria's fiancé, contributed very little to this conversation. He mostly listened to his parents, occasionally nodding, occasionally interjecting with a comment that was designed to show that he understood what they were talking about. I was beginning to understand that Daniel was the kind of man who had been born into money, who had never had to work particularly hard for anything, and who had subsequently developed a personality that was mainly composed of repetitions of his parents' opinions and philosophies. Victoria did not participate in the money conversation at all. She ate her meal quietly, occasionally making eye contact with me. And I could see in her eyes that she was trying to communicate something. Apology, maybe, or explanation, or perhaps just a request for patience. When the waiter came around to ask if we wanted dessert, Margot said, with a particular kind of smile, "I never eat dessert. I find that it's important to maintain discipline about these things. It's so easy to let oneself go, especially as one gets older." She looked at me when she said this, her eyes traveling briefly to my midsection. She was, I realized, insulting my body. She was suggesting that I had let myself go, that I lacked discipline, that this was a character flaw as much as a physical one. Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, and I watched her shrink slightly, the way she always did when confronted with the casual cruelty of people who thought that money entitled them to say whatever they wanted to, whoever they wanted. Philippe ordered a bottle of champagne. Not regular champagne, he clarified, but vintage champagne from a particular vineyard in France that was apparently produced in such limited quantities that it was almost impossible to find. He seemed quite proud of the fact that the restaurant had a bottle, and he made certain to mention that it cost $800. When it arrived, he tasted it, made a show of approving it, and then poured glasses for everyone at the table. Before we drank, he launched into a speech about the history of this particular champagne, about the winemaker who had created it, about the year it was produced, and why that year was significant for champagne production. It was a long speech. He seemed to think that by educating us about the champagne, he was educating us about culture, about taste, about the things that separated people like him and Margot from people like me. When he finished, he raised his glass and said, "To Victoria and Daniel, may their union bring them happiness and prosperity." Everyone raised their glasses and drank. The champagne tasted like champagne. It tasted like bubbles and fermentation and expensive advertising. I drank it and said nothing, and I watched Margot watch me drink it, as if she was trying to see whether I could even appreciate what I was drinking. After dessert was cleared, Philippe made an announcement. He said that he had a gift for Victoria and Daniel. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check. Not a card with a check inside, but an actual physical check that he unfolded and placed on the table in front of them. He had written a check for $250,000. He called it a small gesture, a starter fund for their married life, a way to help them get established in the world. The amount was so large that Victoria actually gasped. She put her hand to her mouth, and her eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked like a child who had just received an unexpected gift. Daniel looked like he had just been handed the keys to a kingdom, and Margot smiled, a smile that said, "This is what success looks like. This is what it means to belong to our family. This is what Victoria is marrying into." Then Philippe looked at me, and he said, with a kind of casual kindness that was somehow more insulting than anything he had said all evening, "And, Eleanor, perhaps this will help ease some of your financial burden. I'm sure it must be difficult, working retail and managing life on your own. We want Victoria to have the best of everything, and that means being able to support you if necessary." He was offering to subsidize my poverty. He was saying, in front of everyone at the table, that he knew I was struggling and that his family was wealthy enough and generous enough to help. He was establishing, once and for all, the hierarchy that had been implicit all evening. He was at the top. I was at the bottom. And Victoria was caught somewhere in the middle, trying to decide which world she belonged to. I looked at Victoria, and I saw tears in her eyes. But they were not happy tears. They were tears of shame. They were tears that said, "I'm sorry my mother is poor. I'm sorry my mother can't give you $250,000. I'm sorry my mother is embarrassing." And in that moment, something snapped inside me. I had come to this dinner to test whether Daniel and his family could accept Victoria regardless of her circumstances. And I had gotten my answer. They couldn't. Or rather, they could, but only in a limited way. Only if Victoria was willing to be grateful. Only if Victoria was willing to acknowledge that their wealth was something to aspire to, something that made them better than her, something that she needed to be rescued by. I set my champagne glass down very carefully on the table. The crystal made a soft sound as it touched the white tablecloth. Everyone at the table noticed. They were all looking at me, waiting to see how the poor woman would respond to the rich man's charity. They were waiting to see if I would cry, if I would be grateful, if I would acknowledge that they had just given me and my daughter an enormous gift. And instead, I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, and as I stood, I reached up to my head and removed the wig. My real hair, the gray hair that I had earned over 58 years of living, fell down around my shoulders. I watched Margot's face go pale. I watched Philippe's expression shift from casual kindness to confusion. I watched Daniel look like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complicated, and I watched Victoria, my daughter, my beautiful daughter, who had been taught by me that integrity was more important than image, start to understand what was happening. "My name," I said quietly, my voice completely different from the uncertain voice I had been using all evening, "is Eleanor Catherine Prescott, and I have something to tell you all about Eleanor." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. I turned it toward the table so that everyone could see the balance. The balance was $7.3 million. I watched Margot's mouth fall open. I watched Philippe try to maintain his composure and fail. I watched Daniel look like someone had just hit him in the back of the head with a 2x4. "This money," I continued, still speaking quietly, still speaking calmly, was inherited from my late husband, Thomas Prescott, 20 years ago. He left me a trust fund of $3.5 million. Over the past 20 years, I have managed this money carefully, invested it wisely, and watched it grow. I have also continued to work, not in retail, but as a private financial advisor to several high-net-worth individuals. My annual income, on average, is between $400,000 and $500,000 per year. I am, in other words, wealthier than most of the people in this room. I am certainly wealthier than you are, Philippe. Philippe's face had gone a color I had never seen a human face go before. It was something between purple and gray. He opened his mouth to say something, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Margot reached over and put her hand on his arm, as if she was afraid he might have a stroke. I turned my attention to her. "Do you know what I did this evening, Margot?" I asked. "I came to this dinner dressed as poor because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you were superior to the people you were with. I wanted to see whether you would treat my daughter with more respect if her mother had money. And do you know what I learned?" Margot shook her head, unable to speak. "I learned that you are exactly the kind of person I suspected you were. You are a woman who measures human worth in dollars. You are a woman who can only be kind to people if she believes she is their superior. You are a woman who thought that offering to subsidize me was a gesture of generosity, when in fact it was a gesture of cruelty. It was a way of saying that you felt sorry for me, that you thought I was beneath you, that I should be grateful for your attention." I turned to Philippe. "And you," I said, "are a man who has confused money with wisdom. You have confused the ability to make investments with the ability to understand human beings. You have spent this entire evening explaining things to me as if I was a simpleton, and you have done it with such arrogance that you didn't even realize you were insulting me." I paused, and then I said the thing I had been waiting to say all evening. "The check you gave to Victoria and Daniel? The $250,000? I make that much in 6 months. I have more money in my checking account right now than most people have in their entire lives. And the reason I didn't tell you about it is because I knew that the moment you found out, you would suddenly become interested in me. You would want to know me. You would want to include me in your lives. And that kind of friendship, that kind of family relationship, is worthless to me. It's worth less than nothing, because it's predicated on the only thing in me that you value, and that thing is money. Not my character, not my intelligence, not my kindness or my humor or my wisdom. Just the number in my bank account." Victoria had her hand over her mouth. She was staring at me with an expression that was somewhere between shock and awe, and something that looked like relief. Daniel was staring at the phone in the middle of the table, trying to process the numbers he had just seen. His entire understanding of the evening, of his engagement, of Victoria, of the dynamics of his family, was being recalibrated in real time. Margot suddenly became very interested in her napkin. She folded it and refolded it, and she would not make eye contact with me. Philippe cleared his throat several times, as if trying to dislodge something that was stuck there. "Eleanor," he said finally, and his voice had lost its authoritative quality. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We certainly didn't mean to suggest that." "I know what you meant," I interrupted. "You meant exactly what I said you meant? And that's not the real problem?" I leaned forward slightly. "The real problem is that you have raised a son who doesn't know how to think for himself. The real problem is that you have taught him that money is the most important thing in the world. The real problem is that you are about to destroy his relationship with my daughter because you care more about maintaining your superiority than you care about his happiness. I turned to Daniel. Do you love Victoria? I asked him directly. He looked at me, confused. Yes, of course, he said. Because if you do, I continued, then you need to understand something about her. She is not marrying you for your money. She's marrying you because she believed that you were a good person. She's marrying you because she thought that your family was the kind of family that valued things beyond money. But your family doesn't. Your family values money above everything, above kindness, above honesty, above integrity. And if you marry Victoria while still believing the things your parents have taught you to believe, then you are going to spend the rest of your life trying to make her feel small. You're going to try to convince her that she should be grateful to you. You're going to make her feel like she's not enough. And eventually, you're going to destroy her. Daniel's face had gone very still. I could see him processing this, turning it over in his mind, beginning to realize that I was saying something true. What do you want us to do? Victoria asked, her voice small. I turned to look at her, and I softened. Because Victoria was the reason for all of this. Victoria was the innocent party in this equation. I want you, I said, to understand that you don't need their money. You never needed their money. You're a smart, capable, talented woman, and you can build a life for yourself based on who you are, not on who your family is or how much money they have. And I want you to understand that if Daniel loves you, truly loves you, then he will understand that too. He will understand that what matters is not the size of his parents' bank account, but the size of his heart. I looked back at Margot and Philippe. As for the two of you, I said, I want you to understand something. I came here tonight expecting to be treated poorly, and I was. I came here expecting to be looked down upon, and I was. But what I didn't expect was to realize how utterly pathetic that makes you. You are people who can only feel good about yourselves if you are making someone else feel bad. You are people who are so fundamentally insecure about who you are that you need the constant reassurance of people looking up to you. And that is a very sad way to live. I picked up my purse, my old, falling apart purse that had been my mother's. I'm going to leave now, I said, and I'm going to pay for this dinner. I pulled out my actual wallet, the one I had been carrying underneath my costume, and I placed my credit card on the table. It was a black Centurion card, the kind of card that only the wealthiest people in the world have access to. It was a card that said, without words, that I had already reached the pinnacle of what money could buy. The bill is $800 for the champagne alone, plus the rest of the meal. I am going to pay for it, and I am going to pay for it not because I'm trying to prove something, but because I believe in paying my own way. I believe in taking care of myself, and I believe that this evening was worth the cost, if only because it allowed me to see exactly who you were. I stood up, and I looked at Victoria one more time. I'll be waiting to hear from you, honey, I said. When you're ready to talk, I'll be there. And Victoria, one more thing. Daniel can either grow up and become his own person, or he can spend the rest of his life being his parents' puppet. But that's his choice to make. Not yours. Not theirs. His. And then I left. I walked out of that restaurant, and I didn't look back. I could feel every eye in the dining room on me as I left, but I didn't care. I had said what I needed to say. I had shown them who I really was, and now I could only wait to see what they would do with that information. The drive home was quiet. I had turned off my phone before dinner, a decision I now appreciated because it meant I didn't have to deal with any immediate reactions or explanations or apologies. I simply drove through the city streets, past the buildings and the lights and the people, all of whom were going about their lives without any awareness that mine had just fundamentally shifted. I had always known I was capable of confrontation. I had always known I could stand up for myself. But there had been something different about standing up for Victoria, about defending my daughter against people who would have her believe that she was somehow less than. That had unleashed something in me that I hadn't known was there. It had unleashed a kind of rage that was clean and pure and absolutely justified. When I got home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, in the dark, and I waited. I waited for the phone calls that I knew would come. I waited for the emails that I knew would be sent. I waited for the explanations and the apologies and the attempts at reconciliation. They came faster than I expected. Victoria called at 10:30 that night. She was crying. "Mom," she said, "I don't even know what to say. I don't know whether to be angry at you, or grateful, or confused, or all of those things at once." "Tell me how you're feeling," I said. "I'm feeling like the last 8 hours have been a fever dream," Victoria said. "I'm feeling like everything I thought I understood about my life just turned upside down. Daniel is sitting on my couch right now, and he's not saying anything. He's just staring into space. His parents have been calling him nonstop, but he's turned his phone off." "How are you feeling about that?" I asked. "I don't know," Victoria said. "Part of me is terrified. Part of me is relieved. Part of me is angry at you for humiliating my future in-laws." "I didn't humiliate them," I said quietly. "I revealed them. There's a difference. I showed them who they are. And now they have to decide whether they want to change or whether they want to continue being the people they've always been." Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Did you have to do it that way? Did you have to set them up like that?" I considered the question. It was a fair question. "Probably not," I admitted. "I could have simply told you that I was uncomfortable with how they treated me. I could have had a conversation with them privately. I could have handled this in any number of ways that didn't involve public humiliation." "So why didn't you?" Victoria asked. "Because I wanted them to understand," I said. "I wanted them to really understand, not just intellectually but emotionally, what it feels like to be judged based solely on your circumstances. I wanted them to experience, for one evening, what it felt like to be looked down upon. And I wanted you to see that you don't have to feel ashamed of who you are or where you come from." Victoria started crying harder. "I was ashamed," she said. "I was so ashamed. When they were talking about their money and their houses and their investments, all I could think was that I was sorry my mother couldn't compete with that. I was sorry that I couldn't give you things. And then, when he offered you that money, I felt like I wanted to disappear because it made so explicit what I had been feeling implicitly all evening, that there was something wrong with me for coming from a background that wasn't wealthy enough, wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't enough." I felt my heart break a little bit for her, because Victoria was smart enough to understand, intellectually, that money wasn't everything. But she was also human enough to be affected by the relentless messaging she received from society about the importance of wealth. And watching someone try to navigate that contradiction is painful. "Listen to me," I said. "What you felt tonight was not a reflection of reality. It was a reflection of how Margot and Philippe made you feel. And they made you feel that way intentionally, because they wanted you to feel indebted to them. They wanted you to feel like you had married above your station. They wanted you to feel grateful. That's how people maintain control, by making the people around them feel grateful. Victoria was quiet again. Then she said, Daniel just told me something. He said that his parents have been pressuring him to break up with me. He said they thought I was unsuitable, that I didn't have the right background, that I would hold him back. He said they were hoping that if they demonstrated their wealth often enough, it would make him see the difference between their lifestyle and mine, and that he would leave me. My blood went cold. Did he say he agreed with them? I asked. No, Victoria said. He said he didn't agree with them. But he also said he's never really thought about it before. He just sort of accepted what they told him without question. And now he's realizing that he spent his entire life believing things he doesn't actually believe, doing things he doesn't actually want to do, all because he was afraid of disappointing his parents. And how does he feel about that? I asked. I think he's angry, Victoria said. I think he's realizing for the first time that his parents don't actually care about his happiness. They care about what his happiness means for them. They care about whether he's living in a way that reflects well on them. And that's a hard realization to come to. Over the next few days, I received a series of communications from Philippe and Margot. The first was an email from Philippe, sent the day after the dinner, in which he apologized for any misunderstandings and suggested that we had all gotten off on the wrong foot. He used the phrase, just a little misunderstanding, 3 times in a single paragraph, as if repetition would somehow make the situation less serious. He also suggested that perhaps we could meet again in a more relaxed setting and put this whole thing behind us. The message was carefully calibrated to avoid acknowledging anything that I had said or done. It was an apology that wasn't really an apology from a man who wasn't really sorry. The second communication came from Margot, also via email, in which she took a different approach. She apologized more directly, acknowledged that she had been rude and dismissive, and suggested that she had been defensive because she didn't understand Eleanor's background. She also explained at some length that she had grown up poor, that she had worked hard to escape poverty, and that she sometimes had triggers around people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds because they reminded her of a time in her life that she was trying to forget. It was a more genuine apology than Philippe's, but it was also a more manipulative one because it was designed to make me understand her, to make me sympathize with her, to make me feel like I had been unfair to her because I hadn't known about her difficult background. I didn't respond to either email. Instead, I waited. I knew that Margot and Philippe would eventually realize that the apologies weren't going to work. I knew that Victoria and Daniel would begin to feel pressure from his family to reconcile, to make peace, to return to the way things were before. And I wanted to see how they would handle that pressure. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of increasingly desperate emails, of phone calls that went to voicemail, of messages left with Victoria asking me to please call them back so we could discuss this like adults. 3 weeks of watching Daniel try to navigate the space between his love for Victoria and his loyalty to his family. And then, finally, Victoria and Daniel came to visit me at my house. It was a Saturday morning, and I had made coffee and fresh pastries. We sat in my living room, the same living room where I had spent so many hours alone after Thomas died, the same living room where I had learned to be comfortable with myself. Daniel wants to talk to you, Victoria said. Daniel nodded, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I wanted to apologize, he said. Not for my parents, obviously, because that's their responsibility. But for myself. I wanted to apologize for being so passive, so willing to let my parents dictate my life without even questioning them. I wanted to apologize for not seeing what was happening, not recognizing how they were treating Victoria, not standing up for her. "Thank you," I said. "But the apology that matters most is the one you need to give to Victoria. The rest of us are secondary." Daniel looked at Victoria, and she reached over and took his hand. He said, "I've made a decision. I'm going to set boundaries with my parents. I'm going to tell them that they can be in my life only if they respect my choices and treat the people I love with kindness. And if they can't do that, then they don't get to be in my life." It was a strong statement. It was the kind of statement that would have significant consequences. "How do your parents feel about that?" I asked. "They're not happy," Daniel said. "My father accused me of being ungrateful. My mother cried and said I was breaking her heart. They both suggested that Victoria was poisoning me against them, that if I just agreed to cut off contact with you, everything could go back to normal." "And what did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them that I wasn't interested in going back to normal," Daniel said. "I told them that normal was them treating my fiancé's mother like she was something they had stepped in. I told them that normal was them assuming they were better than everyone around them. I told them that I didn't want to be the kind of person who participated in that anymore." I felt something shift inside me. Something relaxed. Because Daniel had made his choice, and he had made it not because I had forced him to, but because he had thought about it and realized that it was the choice he wanted to make. "Your parents will probably come around," I said. "Eventually. Not immediately and not completely, but eventually. Right now they're scared. They're scared of losing control over you. They're scared of what it means about them if you can succeed without their money and their influence. But people change, eventually, when they realize that the cost of their behavior is losing the people they love." Victoria said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I was ashamed of you. I'm sorry that I let them make me feel like something was wrong with us." "You're not responsible for their behavior," I said. "You're only responsible for your own, and your behavior has been thoughtful and kind. You recognized, when you saw what they were doing, that it was wrong. And you chose to stand up against it. That's all you can do." Over the next few months, things shifted slowly. Margot and Philippe eventually agreed to meet with Victoria and Daniel, but only after Daniel sent them a formal letter explaining his boundaries. The letter was firm and clear. They could be in his life, but only if they treated everyone with respect and kindness. If they reverted to their old behavior, they would lose access to him and to any future grandchildren they might have. The letter worked, at least partially. They became more careful about what they said. They still occasionally made comments that revealed their underlying beliefs about money and status, but they did it less frequently and less openly. They were learning, slowly, that there were consequences for their behavior. And while they would probably never be the kind of parents that Daniel deserved, they were at least trying to be better. Which was, I realized, all anyone could ask for. 6 months after the dinner, Victoria and Daniel got married. The wedding was beautiful and small, held in a garden rather than in a fancy venue. Because Victoria wanted something that reflected who she actually was, rather than something that reflected who she thought she should be. I wore a simple blue dress that I had bought at a boutique in the city. Not at a discount store, not borrowed from someone else's wardrobe. It was mine, and it was beautiful, and I felt like myself wearing it. The ceremony was brief and moving. Daniel spoke about love being a choice, something you made every day, something that required you to be honest with yourself and the people around you. Victoria spoke about gratitude, not for money, not for status, but for the people who loved her enough to tell her the truth, even when that truth was difficult to hear. My friend Catherine, who had known me since my college days, leaned over and whispered to me, "You should be very proud of the woman she became." And I realized that I was. I was incredibly proud of Victoria. Not because she had married well, not because she had found someone with money, but because she had found someone who respected her, someone who loved her, someone who was willing to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him something to do so. Margot and Philippe attended the wedding. They were polite, they were civil, and they even danced during the reception. Margot came up to me at one point and said, with something that resembled genuine warmth, "Your daughter has made my son very happy. I'm grateful for that." It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of everything that had happened. But it was a beginning. It was an opening. And I accepted it as such. Because I had learned a long time ago that people's growth is rarely linear. People don't change in a single moment. They change slowly, in incremental steps, with frequent backsliding and moments of regression. The important thing is that they're moving in the right direction. After the wedding, Daniel's family dynamic continued to shift. Margot reduced her hours at her company, something I found surprising until she told Victoria that she wanted to spend more time on things that actually mattered. She began volunteering at a charity that helped low-income families access financial education. She didn't talk about it much, and she certainly didn't use it as a way to congratulate herself on her charity. But she did it, and it seemed to be changing her perspective on the world. Philippe, for his part, began investing more intentionally in social enterprises, companies that made money but also had a social mission. He became less focused on the size of his portfolio and more focused on the impact of his investments. It was a slow change, but it was a change. And that mattered. Life moved on. Victoria and Daniel bought a small house, nothing fancy, and they furnished it together with pieces they loved. They were building a life based on their values rather than on the opinions of people around them. They were building a life together, and that life was beautiful in its simplicity and its authenticity. I continued my work as a financial advisor. I continued managing my money carefully and living simply. I continued to believe that the most valuable things in life had nothing to do with money. But I also continued to think about that dinner, about the moment I stood up and removed the wig, about the expressions on Margot and Philippe's faces when they realized who I actually was. I thought about it a lot, actually. Not with satisfaction, though there had been satisfaction in the moment, but with something more complicated, with a kind of sadness, actually. A sadness that we live in a world where people feel the need to judge each other based on circumstances beyond their control. A sadness that we have built a society in which money determines not just material comfort, but also worth, dignity, respect. A sadness that it took such a dramatic revelation to make people understand what I had known all along, that real worth has nothing to do with how much money you have. One evening, about a year after the wedding, I was sitting in my garden, reading a book, when my phone rang. It was Margot. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice sounded different than it had at the wedding. It sounded humble. "I'm calling because I wanted to tell you something. I've been thinking a lot about the dinner, about what happened, about what you said. And I've realized some things about myself that I'm not particularly proud of." I didn't say anything. I let her continue. "I realized," Margot said, "that I spent so much of my life running away from poverty that I spent my entire adult life trying to prove that I was above it. And in doing that, I became someone that I'm not sure I like very much. I became someone who measured people based on money. I became someone who thought that wealth meant I was better than other people. And I've been thinking about what you said, that I can only feel good about myself if I'm making someone else feel bad. And I realized that you were right. She paused. I'm not saying this to get your forgiveness, she continued. I'm saying this because I wanted you to know that what you did that night, humiliating me, revealing me, it worked. It made me look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw. And I've been trying, since that night, to become someone better. Someone who doesn't need to measure herself against other people. Someone who doesn't need wealth to feel like she has worth. And I'm finding that the more I do that, the happier I am. I'm finding that life is actually quite beautiful when you're not constantly competing with everyone around you. I felt something soften in my chest. Thank you for telling me that, I said. I'm glad that the evening served its purpose. I have one more thing to tell you, Margot said. Daniel told me that he's planning to leave his father's company. He's been working there because he felt obligated, but he's realized that he doesn't actually want that life. He wants to do something that matters to him. And I told him that I support that decision completely. I told him that I'm proud of him for choosing happiness over money, and I meant it. After we hung up the phone, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the sunset, thinking about all the ways that life can surprise you. Thinking about how sometimes the most important moments are the ones that make you uncomfortable, that challenge you, that force you to look at yourself and ask whether you're the person you want to be. I had set out that evening to test whether Daniel and his family could accept Victoria, regardless of her circumstances. But what I had really done was give them a gift. I had given them the opportunity to become better versions of themselves. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them, had taken that opportunity. A year and a half after the wedding, I received a call from Victoria telling me that she was pregnant. She and Daniel wanted to buy a larger house, and they wanted me to help them think through the financial aspects of the purchase. I drove to their current house on a Saturday morning, and we sat at their kitchen table while Victoria showed me a list of properties they were considering. None of them were particularly expensive. They were choosing based on whether the neighborhood was good, whether the house had character, whether they could see themselves living there. They were not choosing based on price tag, and they were not trying to compete with anyone else's house. They were choosing what they actually wanted. I was impressed by this. By the way they had learned to make decisions based on their own values rather than on what they thought would impress people. As we were going through the financials, Daniel said, Eleanor, I wanted to tell you something. I'm starting my own company. I'm going to leave my father's firm, and I'm going to start something that I actually care about. What kind of company? I asked. A company that provides microloans to small businesses in developing countries, Daniel said. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I realize that I don't want to spend my life just making money. I want to spend my life actually doing something that makes a difference. I looked at Daniel, and I saw in his face the man he had become since that dinner. I saw someone who was willing to risk financial security for the sake of his values. I saw someone who was no longer willing to let his family dictate his choices. I saw someone who had grown. Your parents must have had thoughts about that, I said. They did, Daniel said. My father tried to convince me that it was a bad business decision. He tried to explain to me that I would make more money working for him than starting my own company. But I didn't care. I don't care about making the most money. I care about making a difference, and my mother actually supported me. She said that what I was doing was more important than money, which is a big shift for her, because 5 years ago, I don't think she would have said that. Over the next few years, I watched Daniel's company grow. It wasn't the fastest growing company. It wasn't the most profitable company. But it was successful, and more importantly, it was making a difference. And I watched as Daniel's relationship with his parents continued to evolve. They were never going to be the parents that Daniel deserved. They were still, at their core, people who valued money and status. But they were learning to value other things too. They were learning to be proud of their son, not for what he could acquire, but for the person he was becoming. When Victoria gave birth to their daughter, they came to the hospital with flowers and congratulations, and when they held their granddaughter, something shifted in their eyes. I watched them look at this tiny human being and realize, perhaps for the first time, that the most important things in life cannot be bought with money. You cannot buy a meaningful relationship. You cannot buy integrity. You cannot buy the joy of holding your granddaughter for the first time. You can only experience those things, and you can only experience them if you are the kind of person who values them. I held my granddaughter for the first time on a Tuesday morning. Her name was Sophie, and she was perfect in the way that babies are perfect. Completely useless, completely dependent, completely deserving of every resource in the world. I looked down at her tiny face, and I thought about all the ways that my children and their children would be shaped by the world around them. I thought about whether they would learn to value money above all else, or whether they would learn to value the things that actually matter. I thought about my role in shaping that. Because I had done something that night at the restaurant that had ripple effects extending far into the future. I had revealed truths that had needed to be revealed. I had forced people to look at themselves, and I had given my daughter permission to be exactly who she was without apology. As I grew older, I realized that the dinner had been one of those moments in life that changed everything about the way forward. It had been a pivot point. It had been a moment where I could have chosen to be silent, to let people believe what they wanted to believe, to preserve the peace. But I had chosen instead to speak truth, and that choice had had consequences. Some of them good, some of them difficult, all of them real. Margot eventually stepped down as CEO of her resort chain and started a nonprofit that provided hospitality training to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. She still loved luxury, still loved beautiful things, but she had learned to balance that love with a commitment to helping other people. Philippe eventually retired from his company and took up teaching. He taught finance classes to low-income high school students, trying to pass on his knowledge about money in a way that was empowering rather than intimidating. They were both still, fundamentally, the people they had always been. But they were better versions of those people, and that was what I had wanted all along. Not for them to change completely, to abandon everything about themselves and start over, but for them to become more conscious, more intentional, more aware of the impact they had on the people around them. Not for them to be perfect, but for them to try. And years later, I would remember that dinner, and I would think about whether it had been right or wrong to do what I did. And I still wasn't sure. I still believed that the truth needed to be told. I still believed that Victoria needed to see that she didn't have to be ashamed of who she was. But I also believed that I could have found another way to tell that truth. I could have been kinder. I could have been gentler. I could have given them an opportunity to show me who they were before I tested them so publicly. I could have been a lot of things different, but I wasn't. And so I lived with the consequences of my choices, just as everyone lives with the consequences of their choices. And those consequences, while not all positive, were not all negative either. They were mixed, complicated, real. And that, I realized, was the most honest way to live. By the time Sophie was 3 years old, everything had settled into a new normal. Victoria and Daniel lived in their house with their daughter and their dog. Margot and Philippe visited regularly, and they were actually pleasant people to be around. They had learned to ask questions about other people's lives without immediately comparing them to their own. They had learned to listen rather than to dominate conversations. They had learned that there was value in people and experiences that money could not buy. Daniel's company was thriving. It had expanded into 5 countries and had provided over 10,000 loans to small business owners. Daniel worked long hours, but he was happy. He was doing something that mattered to him, and that made all the difference in how he carried himself through the world. Victoria had taken a break from her career to be with Sophie, but she was planning to go back to work when Sophie started school. She didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. She wasn't trying to compete with Margot or with anyone else. She was simply living her life on her own terms. I was still working as a financial advisor, still managing money carefully, still living in the house I had bought so many years ago with my late husband. I had mentored several younger financial advisors, passing on not just the technical knowledge of how to manage money, but also the philosophy that money was a tool for living well, not an end in itself. I had become something of a fixture in the financial world, known not for the amount of money I had accumulated, but for the integrity with which I had accumulated it and the wisdom with which I distributed it. I gave away a significant portion of my earnings to charitable causes. I funded scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford higher education. I donated to organizations that aligned with my values. And I did this not because I expected recognition or reward, but because I believed that having money gave me a responsibility to use that money for good. One day, about 5 years after the dinner, I received an invitation to give a speech at a financial conference. The organizers wanted me to talk about my philosophy on wealth, about how I had managed to maintain my values while accumulating significant financial resources. I was hesitant at first. I am not, by nature, someone who enjoys being in the spotlight. But I thought about the impact I might have if I told my story, if I explained my philosophy, if I gave people permission to think about wealth in a different way. So I agreed. The speech took place in a large auditorium filled with financial professionals of all stripes. There were hedge fund managers and investment bankers and venture capitalists and financial advisors like myself. There were people who had dedicated their lives to making money, and I was about to stand in front of them and suggest that maybe making money wasn't the most important thing. I was nervous, but when I stood up to speak and I looked out at the faces in the crowd, I felt something settle inside me. I had something to say that needed to be said. And so I began. I told them about Thomas, about my journey as a single mother, about the years of hard work that had allowed me to accumulate wealth. I told them about the dinner with Margot and Philippe. I told them about the moment I took off the wig and revealed who I really was. I told them about the consequences and the ripple effects that one moment had created. And then I said something that I had spent years thinking about. I spent many years believing that the point of making money was to reach a number where I could finally feel secure. I thought that there was some magical amount of money that would finally make me feel like I had enough, like I could relax, like I could stop worrying about the future. But I have reached that number many times over, and I have never felt that security. Because real security doesn't come from money. Real security comes from knowing who you are. It comes from having integrity. It comes from surrounding yourself with people who love you for yourself, not for what you can give them. And those things have nothing to do with how much money you have. I paused and I looked out at the crowd. Some people were nodding. Some people were skeptical. Some people were openly hostile. I could see it in their faces, the resistance to the idea that money might not be the most important thing. "I'm not telling you to stop working," I continued. "I'm not telling you to give away all your money and live in poverty. I'm telling you to ask yourself what you're working toward. Are you working toward a number? Are you working toward a status? Are you working toward a way of life? Or are you working toward something deeper, toward a way of being in the world that feels authentic and meaningful?" Because the sad truth is that many of you will spend your entire lives working toward the first set of goals, and you will reach all of them and still feel empty. And some of you, a lucky few, will figure out that the second set of goals is what actually matters. And those of you will have a very different experience of wealth. After the speech, people approached me with questions and comments. Some of them were grateful, saying that my words had resonated with them, that they had been thinking about these same issues. Some of them were defensive, trying to convince me that money was important, that I was being naive, that the world didn't work the way I was suggesting it worked. And some of them were simply curious, asking me questions about how I had built my career, how I had managed to maintain my values in an industry that often didn't reward values. I answered them all honestly, because honesty, I had learned, was the foundation of everything. Honesty about who I was, honesty about what I wanted, honesty about the choices I had made and the consequences of those choices. Honesty was the only thing that had never failed me. Years continued to pass. Sophie grew older, and she became a curious, thoughtful child who asked questions about everything. She wanted to understand how the world worked, why people did the things they did, what made something right or wrong. I watched Victoria and Daniel raise her with intentionality, trying to pass on their values, trying to teach her that money was important, but not sacred, that integrity was more important than status, that kindness was the most valuable thing she could offer the world. Margot and Philippe were devoted grandparents. They took Sophie on trips and bought her gifts, but they also taught her about managing money, about understanding where resources came from, about being grateful for what she had. And Sophie, with the clarity that only children possess, accepted all of this without judgment. She didn't see her grandparents as bad people. She saw them as people who loved her and who were trying their best to be good. She was right, I realized. That's what they were doing. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And effort, genuine effort, was what mattered. One day, when Sophie was 8 years old, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. She said, "Great-Grandma Eleanor, why did you pretend to be poor at the dinner with Grandma Margot and Grandpa Philippe?" I had not known that she knew about the dinner. I had not known that Victoria or Daniel had told her the story, but apparently they had, because she knew all about it, and she wanted to understand my motivations. I sat down with Sophie, and I tried to explain it to her in a way that an 8-year-old could understand. "I pretended to be poor," I said, "because I wanted to see how people would treat me if they thought I didn't have money, and I wanted to know if people's worth in their eyes was based on how much money they had. Does that make sense?" Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Did you find out?" she asked. "I did," I said. "I found out that some people, your grandparents, judge people based on how much money they have. They thought I was worth less because they thought I was poor. And that made me sad, because I thought they were smarter than that. I thought they understood that money doesn't determine a person's worth." Sophie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't you think maybe they just didn't know that you thought that way?" Don't you think maybe if you had just told them, they would have understood? I felt something shift inside me when she said that, because Sophie was 8 years old, and she had just articulated something that I had been struggling with for years. I had tested Margot and Philippe. I had set them up to fail, and I had done it without giving them the opportunity to choose differently. I had assumed that they would behave a certain way, and then I had created a scenario to prove that assumption correct. And yes, they had behaved that way, but they had never been given a real choice. They had never been told, "This is how I'm feeling, and this is what I need from you." I had simply been tested, found wanting, and humiliated. "You're very wise for 8 years old," I said to Sophie. "You're right. I could have handled it differently. I could have just told your grandparents how I was feeling. I could have given them a chance to choose to be better without having to learn the hard way." "Did they end up being better anyway?" Sophie asked. "Yes," I said. "They did. It took time, but they figured it out." "So maybe the way you did it worked," Sophie said, "even if it wasn't the nicest way to do it." I looked at this small child, this 8-year-old girl, who was somehow wise beyond her years, and I realized that she had captured something essential about the situation. My method had worked, even if it wasn't the kindest method. But that didn't mean it was the right method, and that was a lesson I needed to learn. I needed to learn that just because something works doesn't mean it was right. Just because I achieved my goal doesn't mean I achieved it in the way that I should have. And just because people ended up in a better place doesn't mean that the journey to get there was justified. These were hard lessons. These were lessons that required me to look at myself critically and ask whether I was the person I wanted to be. And the answer, increasingly, was no. Not because I was a bad person, but because I was capable of being better. I was capable of confronting people with honesty without using humiliation. I was capable of standing up for my values without tearing other people down in the process. I was capable of all of those things, and I had not done them. And so I spent time, over the following years, thinking about that dinner differently. I thought about it not as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of learning. I thought about it not as proof of my superiority, but as evidence of my own flaws, my willingness to manipulate people, my need to be right, my assumption that I knew better than people what they needed to learn. These were uncomfortable realizations, but they were important ones. Because if I was going to spend the rest of my life telling other people to have integrity, to be honest, to face themselves critically, then I needed to do those things myself. I needed to be the person I was asking other people to be. And that was harder than any financial calculation I had ever done. In the final years of my life, and yes, I know that I am in the final years because I can feel it in my bones, in my energy levels, in the way my body is slowly failing me. I have come to see that dinner in a completely different light. It was a pivotal moment, certainly. It changed the trajectory of several lives. But it was not the moment of triumph that I had believed it to be. It was a moment where I made a choice, and that choice had consequences, some good and some not so good. Margot and Philippe did become better people. Daniel did find his own path. Victoria did learn to stand up for herself, but the price was paid in humiliation, in shame, in a kind of public degradation that, while not permanent, was certainly real. And I have spent the last decades wondering whether that price was necessary. I have spent the last decades wondering whether I could have achieved the same results through kindness instead of cruelty, through honesty instead of deception, through direct conversation instead of elaborate setup. And I don't have an answer. I don't know whether I was right or wrong. I don't know whether what I did was necessary or whether it was simply the most dramatic option available to me. What I do know is that I am grateful for how things turned out. I am grateful that Victoria and Daniel built a life together based on their values. I am grateful that Sophie grew up with grandparents who had learned, over time, to see her as a person rather than as a status symbol. I am grateful that Daniel found work that mattered to him. I am grateful that Margot and Philippe, in their own ways, became more conscious and more intentional about how they moved through the world. But I also know that gratitude is not the same as justification. I can be grateful for the outcome and still question the method. I can be grateful that things worked out and still acknowledge that I could have handled it differently. This is what wisdom is, I think. It's not the ability to always make the right choice. It's the ability to look at the choices you made and understand them fully. To see both the good and the harm they caused. To see both the intended and unintended consequences. To sit with the complexity of it all without needing to reduce it to simple categories of right and wrong. I have written this story down because I want people to understand something. I want them to understand that wealth is not the enemy. Poverty is not the measure of virtue. The problem is not money itself, but the way that we relate to money, the way we use it to establish hierarchies, the way we use it to prove our worth, the way we use it to judge others. Money is simply a tool. It can be used for good or for harm, depending on the person using it. I have spent my life trying to use it for good. I have spent my life trying to remember that the person I am is not determined by the money I have. I have spent my life trying to teach this lesson to others. And in this final chapter of my life, I want to say, if you have money, use it wisely, but don't use it as your identity. Don't use it as proof of your worth. Don't use it to establish yourself as superior to others. Remember that the most important things in life, love, integrity, authentic connection, cannot be purchased. And if you don't have money, know that you are not less than the people who do. Know that your worth is not determined by your bank account. Know that you have just as much to offer the world as anyone else, regardless of their financial circumstances. This is what I have learned in my life. This is what I am trying to pass on to my daughter, to my granddaughter, to everyone I meet. And this is what I want to be remembered for. Not for the money I accumulated, but for the wisdom I tried to share, for the person I tried to be, for the values I tried to live by, for the complicated, imperfect, deeply human choices I made along the way. Life is not a simple story with clear heroes and villains. Life is complex and messy and full of contradictions. We do the best we can with the knowledge and understanding we have at the time. And sometimes, that best is not good enough. And sometimes, it is more than enough. And sometimes, it is something in between. Imperfect, flawed, but also genuine and true. And that, I believe, is the most honest way to live.